and thank you for coming. And we can thank our congregational friend Jason Leaf again for leading us in our reflections and our dialogue about immigration. Jason got us off to a wonderful start last week by helping us listen to the scriptures with respect to this question. And tonight I think he'll lead us into some history as well, but we'll see what he says. You know, probably Jason works at Northwestern College. He also works for the Office of Social Justice in the Christian Reformed Church and for another immigration group. What's the name of that one again, Jay?
National Immigration Forum.
The National Immigration Forum. So he comes with a lot of background on this. And let's call on God to lead us through this dialogue. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for another splendid Sunday. We thank you for another time to reflect on your work in our world and our participation in it. We thank you for your message in Genesis regarding your image in every human being. Inspire us to treat everyone with the dignity that fits your image. Help us to come together so that everyone we know can flourish. Give us your spirit tonight as we continue to listen and dialogue together. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, thanks for letting me come back. Last time we focused, for those of you who weren't here, we focused on Genesis and looking at issues of human flourishing and the question of human dignity. I'm working, yeah? I'm good? Yeah, all right. So we focused on asking the question or trying to reframe the immigration question and look at the issue of human dignity and human flourishing. And so we spent some time in Genesis looking at what it means to be made in the image of God. We talked about Genesis 1 and that kind of functional image. And we talked about Genesis 3 and that kind of relational image. And then we looked at our Genesis 2 and then Genesis 3, talking about the fall and the violence that's been unleashed, and then focusing on the Tower of Babel and seeing the Tower of Babel as really a sense of human protection, building a structure, building a tower to protect themselves. And if we could think of it in the terms also of kind of crafting their own ideology of this is who we are, this is who we want to be, wanting God to be out of the equation, and really kind of grounded in fear. This kind of protection of their own identity, kind of grounded in fear. And then looking at the call of Abraham, that God calls Abraham to be a blessing to the nations, and asking the question about what does it now mean for us as the Christian community as we move from Abraham to the Gospels, and then we went to 2 Peter, or 1 Peter, which we'll look at here in a minute. What does it mean to be the Christian community and to live into this issue? And so Becca is has to do it again for me, but love God, honor the emperor. If you go to 1 Peter, which is the next slide, this is the text that we've kind of focused on. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to draw your attention to a couple of verses. Verse 11, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh." Peter using the language of alien and exiles, this notion of being a pilgrim people as we kind of make our way through this world. And then verse 13, for the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme, or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. And we stopped on this text as a way of asking the question about, what does it mean to honor everyone? What does it mean then to love God? And what does it mean for us as the Christian community to also honor the emperor? And I wanted to focus on this text because really where we get stuck on this issue has to do with the issue of the dignity of human persons, loving our immigrant neighbors, but then also this question of the rule of law and how do we deal with, we are a nation of laws, and how do we kind of reconcile those two things? And so as I go around having conversations on this issue of immigration, that's where we get stuck, is kind of trying to somehow bring these two things together. And I think it's interesting, and this is why I'm using 1 Peter 2, because Peter, I think, seems to also be trying to bring these things together. Now, he's talking to a group of Christians scattered amongst the Roman Empire who are being persecuted for their beliefs, who are being persecuted for their way of life, and he is talking to a suffering people. And he tells them here at the end, honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. And so what I'm wondering this evening is whether or not 1 Peter gives us some insight into what it means to live as the Christian community into this very difficult issue of immigration. To respect the dignity of every human person, to love our neighbors, and at the same time recognize that we are also citizens here of this country, and that we have a responsibility to be politically engaged. And what does that look like for us to do so as a Christian community? So, Becca, if you could go to the next slide. Really quickly, this is how I'm going to go today. I'm going to talk for a little while, and I'm going to save our time of question again for the end. And so I just want to present some things, and then when we get to the end, would love to kind of hear your feedback. So there's a Joel B. Green. I believe he is professor of New Testament at Fuller. I know that he was at Fuller. Has written a commentary on 1 Peter. And so I wanted to go there just to kind of explore a little bit what he has to say. And here's what he writes about this particular passage. He says, for Peter, of course, Rome really was the issue. Its sanctioned religions, its imperial and colonizing presence and practices, its world system, its matrices of honor and order. Now, I start with this because I think sometimes as we read the Bible, it might be easy to spiritualize the thing that Peter is saying. Oh, we're pilgrims in this world, we'll endure suffering. And yet when we read the text, we see he's writing to a particular group of Christians who are also wrestling with, how do I live into my identity in Jesus Christ first and foremost? And yet, I'm also living within this empire with the emperor. And what Joel Green tries to do for us is he says, look, Rome is a big part of what Peter is actually trying to say to them, what they're enduring as they are living as part of the Roman Empire. Becca, if you could go to the next screen. Here's what he writes. Babylon appears in this letter at its close. So if you go to 1 Peter 5:13, he references Babylon, where it serves to recapitulate Peter's perspective on the Christian manner of living developed throughout the letter. The reference to Babylon pulls back the curtain on the real context in which Peter's audience made their lives, focusing attention on the systematic character of harassment and the institutionalization of evil in patterns of sanctioned behavior and organizational structures that legitimate and propagate such behavior. In other words, the people that Peter is writing to are Christians having to try to live out their faith in the midst of an empire who have rules and practices and expectations, and they're having to try to negotiate what does it look like for us to live this out. And I think as we think about how we live out our lives as Christians here in Northwest Iowa or wherever we might live, we have to do the same thing, don't we? We recognize that our identity first and foremost is in Jesus Christ. I don't think anybody in here would question that or deny that. But then we also recognize that we are citizens, right, of this country with its laws and its regulations. And we're left to try to figure out how we engage this, how we do this. When are laws good? When are laws, for lack of a better term, evil? When do our laws need to be changed? When do our laws actually not honor the dignity of human persons? And what does it mean for us as the Christian community to try to seek to live as citizens of this country, recognizing that we're also seeking the honor and dignity of our neighbors, regardless of where they're from? I guess one of the things that I want to emphasize this evening is I don't believe pulling out of politics is an option. Now, maybe you'll disagree with me, and we can have that conversation at the end. but we live in this country. We live in communities. And I don't think just closing our eyes to what's going on around us and pulling out is the solution, or I would argue, the Christian option. Which then forces us to ask serious questions about how we then live as Christians engaged in politics, trying to honor our neighbor, loving God and honoring our neighbor. And what Joel Green is doing in his commentary is he's saying these are the similar issues. These are similar issues that the Christians that he's writing to are having to wrestle with and deal with. And that Peter is talking about these things. That he's talking in some way about politics. Rome is really the issue. The emperor is the issue. Now, it's really interesting. One of my good friends who was watching on Facebook, even before this was over, I could feel my phone like just buzzing like crazy. And it was so funny. As I'm walking home, I'm reading, text after text. And one of the things he says is, we don't have an emperor. And he's right. We don't have an emperor. Right? We have a president that we elect and so on. And so for me, the emperor here becomes symbolic, I think, of the political order in which we live. And how are we going to engage this political order? All right, Becca, next slide. All right, so here's what where he goes on. And I find this to be a fascinating insight that he gives into this text. Right? He says, reverent fear is due God alone. A further denial of the divinity of the emperor. And I'm sure most of you know the emperors at this time, they were claiming divinity and imperial cult, sacrifices, worship, all that stuff that's going on. A further denial of the divinity of the emperor. Most stunning, though, is that the same verb honor names the Christian obligation to all. It is hard to imagine a more devastating critique of the Roman way, for which the pairing of these two directives, Peter has flattened the status pyramid of the Roman world. He has just made one's response to the slave next door no less than one's response to the emperor. In other words, what Peter is doing in this text is, in a sense, de-divinizing the emperor. Honor everyone, right? This is what the text says. The last verse, verse 17. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. And honor the emperor. So in a world where the emperor is divine, Peter is pulling the emperor down onto the same status as everyone else. Not saying, to hell with the emperor, honor the emperor, but pulling the emperor down, de-divinizing, if that makes any sense. Go to the next slide. Which leads me to this. I want to make a suggestion here this evening, and maybe some of you will disagree with me and we can have this conversation. What I fear has happened in our political situation is we have re-divinized the political process. And I put both up there because I don't care what side you're on. I drive up to Minnesota on a regular basis, and it is amazing to me what I see, right? The altars that have been built to both sides. And the ways in which we get involved in our ideological areas, I think, can demonstrate that we have re-divinized politics to where what matters most isn't a thoughtful engagement of why I'm voting for this candidate or why this and not this, but a blind allegiance to the right and a blind allegiance to the left. And I guess my question here this evening is, well, what does it look like for us to de-divinize this process? What does it look like for us to do what Peter is doing and recognize that we're called to honor and engage in the political process, but we do so first and foremost with our identity grounded in Jesus Christ, loving our neighbors, honoring our neighbors, loving the Christian community, loving God first and foremost, and then honoring the emperor. What does that possibly look like? What type of conversations could we begin to have with one another? Now, if you remember at the last time when we were together, one of the goals that I have in having this conversation about immigration is trying to get past our ideological obstacles, which is the most difficult part of this conversation. I have churches, when I call them up and I say, hey, these are the organizations I work for. I'd love to come have a conversation on this issue. I don't get further than that, and they say, no, thank you. We don't want politics right now in the church. It's too far out of hand. Contact us maybe after the election or down the road, but right now, absolutely not. So getting past these ideological barriers, I think, is first and foremost what we need to do before we can actually begin having an honest conversation on this topic. And so tonight what I want to do is I am going to look at a little bit of history. We are going to look a little bit at the immigration issue as it has happened kind of through history as a way to think about our own country, not to say, for shame, how terrible, but just to be honest about where we have been on the immigration issue, where we haven't been so good, where we've actually done well. And there are a couple places I want to highlight where I think as a country we've done really well. And even as a CRC, as a people, as a Christian community, where we have done well, as a way then to kind of set the stage for us to think about where do we go from here? And how do we work together? Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Socialists, I don't know where you land, wherever you land on the spectrum. How do we work together as a Christian community to begin to try to address this issue of immigration and immigration reform in meaningful ways? All right, Becca? So as we think about politics, one of the things that I think is really important, and some of you will recognize the picture of somebody that I'll put up here in a minute, but it's recognizing that politics is not a necessary evil. A reformational perspective would argue that politics itself is grounded in God's good creation. And so as we begin to think about what does a politic look like as we engage the issue of immigration, there's just some points that I want to emphasize here. How do we establish a biblical form of politics that recognizes that human authority is grounded in divine authority? Think again, Genesis 1, made in the image of God. The divine representatives, that functional image, right? That we as humans have been given this authority, but it is one that is grounded in God's authority. How do we develop a politic that, again, respects this notion that all humans are made and created in the image of God? How do we recognize also that to rule over, when we take that subdue the earth, right, that rule over and subdue the earth, and we put it in a Christological context, to rule over is to care for, it is to serve, it is to seek the flourishing of all creation and of our neighbors. And then that is grounded in the relational image. This is where we're talking about Genesis 2, and I was using kind of Rowan Williams to talk about human dignity and the relationality of our identity and how we need one another. We need one another, and that this emphasis then is about seeking the common good and then seeking the flourishing of all creation. Go to the next slide. All right, who knows this guy? Yeah, I figured, right? It's so interesting to me how sometimes I think we can lose sight of something that is just so common to us. This reformational vision of politics that Jim Skillen and the Center for Public Justice focuses on. We become so used to it that we almost yawn at it. And then after a while, when we come back to it, we're kind of taken aback by how insightful I think it actually is, and what this reformational vision has to give for us. So I got a couple quotes from Jim Skillen, and this comes from an article, and I have a link to the article at the end, but here's what he writes. This was an interview that just recently that he did. He says this: that's where our idea of principled pluralism comes in, and everything we've done through CPJ. We've tried to show that the reality of the American Republic is more complex than the ideology of liberalism would have it. We live in a complex social order. Human beings do not function as autonomous individuals, but as family members, as students and teachers in schools, and in many other relationships. So when a government governs, it needs to take into account and do justice to the diversity of other responsibilities that people have. Go to the next slide. All right, this is him continuing. The challenge of being a Christian community in the world today is to serve God with wisdom and love in the actual world in which we live. Right? A realism in which we actually engage the world as it is, the problems that are set before us, not some kind of ideological abstraction, but the world and our neighbor as we encounter them. We should not pretend that the responsibilities of the Christian life can be exercised through superficial efforts, nor should we live and act as if we bear the burdens that only God can bear. Christ has given us a light yoke. We must simply wear it with delight and let God make use of us. But that entails the serious exercise of all the responsibilities that God has given us. Next slide. All right, this is the last one. And you can see this is where the interview was found, sharedjustice.org. 2017, I guess is when it was. He says this: if Christ is calling us out of habits of death to habits of life, then he's calling us not just to eternal life beyond this world, but to the renewal of our lives and labor on earth in anticipation of Christ's fulfillment of creation. Every good law that's passed is a contribution to the kingdom that's being built. God is working in and through us in every area of our lives. Every little thing we do is an offering of thanksgiving to God for the renewal of our lives, including our work as citizens to promote public justice, as kingdom work in service to the King. Now, sometimes I think we can forget. And here, Skillen, obviously, is calling us to engage politics. Not based, remember last time we talked about how this isn't based upon kind of unalienable rights and so on. It is based upon human dignity, as Ron Williams is talking about. And I hear that echoed in what Skillen is saying here too. It's not in some abstraction. This is grounded in a relational understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God, and to take the responsibility God has given us to seek the flourishing of creation and seek the common good through that political realm. Right? I love where he says, every good law that is passed. And what I want to suggest here this evening is that maybe it's also every good law that's tweaked. In other words, we have immigration laws on the books. Is it possible that they're not working well? And if they're not working well, instead of retreating into our ideological camps and fighting with one another, what if we actually began to take steps to say, how do we change these laws for the flourishing of our neighbors and in a way that honors the emperor? Right? All right, next slide. So this is the history part, and I'm not telling you anything many of you probably don't know, but as you look at the history of immigration in this country, there are just some things as we look back on them, we kind of maybe hopefully flinch at just a little bit. We can go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Go to the next slide. We can see in the early 1920s how, and in the early 1900s, how in this country we really wanted to have certain people from Europe come to this country, and we wanted certain people from Europe not to come to this country. So our immigration laws actually reflected this, kind of weighting towards certain Northern European, Western European nations, and not so much Southern European and Eastern European nations. Okay, next slide. Again, and I just heard there was a Fresh Air episode on this, how the United States, this is before World War II, but even after World War II, was really working hard to prevent Polish Jews from immigrating here, or coming to this country. And so again, this is just another example of the ways in which our immigration laws worked against, I think, the flourishing of our own country and the flourishing of other people. Next slide. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act is important, so I've put this up here. We're still working with the criteria that has been set by this law that was passed in 1965. Now, what it did is it took away quotas from countries. So before this, you could emphasize certain countries, de-emphasize others. 1965, it gets de-emphasized. And the primary means of immigration now are family immigration, employment, and then refugees. And we'll talk about refugees here in a minute. Now, there are many things about the passing of this bill that were wonderful, that are good, that were helpful. But now as we look at it, we also recognize some areas where it has created problems. Before the passing of this bill, there really was no kind of quota set upon Western nations and their ability to come to this country. After the passing of this bill, there are some limits set on people who would come from Western nations for the first time. We're talking about Central America, Mexico, and South America. And now as we think about it today, as we think about the people who are our neighbors here in Sioux Center, from Guatemala, from Mexico, from El Salvador, right? It raises questions about some ways in which we can change immigration law, tweak this 1965 law, because maybe it's not working so well today, and maybe there need to be some changes. Okay? Next slide. 1968, there's a change in the way in which we think about refugees, and this is the next thing I want to say, and it'll be the next slide, is really, I think, a positive, especially for people in the state of Iowa, and especially for the Christian Reformed Church. Go to the next slide. 1970 to 1980, after the fall of Saigon, President Ford and Robert Ray, governor of Iowa, and some other governors in this area, we take in refugees from Southeast Asia. And how long ago was it? Just a few weeks ago, a month ago, we had Pastor Kay out here talking about the church in Sioux City and the work that they're doing. So again, there are some very positive things that our country has done when it comes to the issue of immigration, when it comes to taking in refugees and people seeking asylum. And there are some very positive things that even our own church communities have done. And again, we're deeply connected with congregations, local congregations, working with people who have been refugees. All right, next slide. In the 1980s and 90s, and again, some of you have been working, maybe not so much the African ones, but the slide that comes next. We could get immigrants from Africa. Go to the next slide. And then we also have Central American immigrants. And I know that there's been a lot of work done in the Christian Reformed Church, especially with agriculture, as we think about Nicaragua and some of those places, recognizing some of the issues and some of the problems, and also helping to try to deal with things that are going on in their country and the influx of people who are leaving terrible situations there to try to come to this country. Go to the next slide. Now, this is another important place for us to spend a little bit of time. And what's fascinating for me is the ways in which I have bumped up against this law, which on the surface seems very positive, right? So in 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, a bipartisan compromise which offered amnesty to almost 3 million undocumented immigrants, imposed penalties on employers who hire undocumented workers, and increased enforcement at U.S. borders. No changes were made to the legal immigration entry process. Now, positive in the sense that recognizing there are people living here, and when I talk on the immigration issue, wherever I go, nobody says, let's send all of these people back. Nobody does. In fact, everybody recognizes the impracticality of doing that, and that we don't even want to do that. But here's what's fascinating for me. Whenever I meet with Senator Grassley's office, I've met with a couple times, this is the roadblock I bump up against. When I go to Grassley's office to say, hey, what about DACA? Or what about this? The response I get is, I signed on to that bill in 1986. I was told this will deal with the problem. I voted for amnesty. I will not do that again. Right? Because I was told we're not going to be in this situation again. And yet here we are. We're in this situation again. So every time I meet with Grassley's office, I bump up against what happened here. Because for whatever reason, the penalties on employers there wasn't follow through. There were things with the bill that were imperfect. And we're back to where we have an influx of undocumented people living in this country. So now the question is how do we maneuver around those who remember this bill and feel burnt by this bill? But more importantly, how do we get at that last piece? No changes were made to the legal immigration entry process. How do we begin to tweak our immigration laws that actually begin to deal with that process? All right, next slide. 1990 Immigration Act creates a new category, the TPS, Temporary Protected Status. And so you maybe have heard of this in the news. These are people, immigrants who have come to this country, mainly from Africa and Asia, and there are actually some, I think, from Central America, where they're at risk, they're in danger, and so they're given this status, which means that they will not be deported. And lately in the news, what you get is certain people's TPS status being called into question or coming due, and whether or not the administration will continue to provide that status. Now, thus far, we have had it where when those things have come up, the administration has maintained that status. But it has been a source of tension and a question of whether or not some of these populations will retain that status. Go to the next slide. 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, a tough-on-crime measure, attempted to address illegal immigration through mass detention and deportation. It made past or minor crimes deportable offenses, enacted 3- and 10-year bars for legal reentry for those who had been in the country unlawfully, expanded border enforcement, and added more penalties for employing undocumented immigrants. So again, this sense of getting tough on the issue, the 3-year and 10-year bar, there are actually people that I know who have been impacted by this and have told their story about how they have been impacted by this. Now, what's important for us to realize is in 1986, you have Ronald Reagan, a Republican, and here we have in 1996, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, who is enacting this law. All right? Next slide. Of course, DACA, 2012, deferred action for childhood arrival for children who were brought into this country when they were very young. This has been in the news all over the place. You probably know just recently the Supreme Court upheld DACA. What's fascinating about this whole thing is that maybe one of the best things that could have happened is the Supreme Court not uphold DACA. Because the whole argument over DACA isn't whether or not we want these people to stay. It's just not. The Trump administration would say as much as well. It's a question of, did President Obama have the authority to do this executive action? That Congress is the one who should pass a bill for this. Hey, this is the fascinating thing and the most interesting thing for me right now that is really difficult. The Supreme Court upholds DACA. And right before that, it's in the news and all these organizations, and we're talking to DACA recipients, and we're writing op-eds, and we're doing all this stuff, and the Supreme Court makes its decision, and then it just goes away. Talk to a DACA recipient. Ask them how confident they are, because their status is still hanging in the balance, and there needs to be a permanent solution by Congress. And there are bills both in the House and in the Senate. There's a Senate bill that has just been hanging around there for a long time. And the political will is not there for them to take action on this. Okay? Next slide. 2018, 2019, a public charge rules were changed. And so one of the questions about being admitted into this country, whether on visas or whatever else, is would this person become a public charge? So last time, one of the things that I mentioned to you is really one of the biggest things we have to deal with in talking about immigration is our welfare system. Because I've talked to people who are staunchly opposed, on the immigration issue. They don't want citizenship and so on. They'll say to me, I don't have a problem with them being here. I just have a problem with that our government is paying for them. And so what public charge rule is about is it looks at people who are coming into this country and it asks questions about what is the likelihood that these people, this person, would end up on some kind of government welfare or becoming the responsibility of the government. And if they deem that the likelihood is high, they are going to be denied admittance. So again, what does it look like for us as the Christian community to dig deep into the issue of immigration and begin asking serious questions about how we can deal with the diversity of things that begin to pop up? And the public charge is one of them. All right, next slide. This one is one that the organization that I work for and some of the people that I work for are really, really struggling with. Every year, it is the president who, in consultation with Congress, is the one who sets the number of asylum seekers and refugees that we will admit into this country. And under the Trump administration recently, that number has been lowered to levels that we've never seen before. And if you talk to anyone who works in organizations that work with people, refugees and people seeking asylum, they would tell you how difficult these last couple of years really have been. And this is a place, too, where we put up the positive slide, right? Robert Ray, the Christian Reformed Church, welcoming in refugees from Southeast Asia. And I think this is a place where we as the Christian community really have to begin asking some questions. And we can have that conversation here in a little bit. All right, next slide. And of course, what's been going on recently with the pandemic. And look, the pandemic is a very difficult issue, but the numbers really have been lowered. And the number of people being allowed to come in has been lowered immensely. And again, we can argue for and against understanding what's going on in a pandemic, but I think it's important for us to recognize really what has been happening on the political level with our country with regard to immigration and with regard to those seeking asylum based upon what's been going on with the pandemic. All right, next slide. All right. So all of that, and I know I went through it fast. You know, I could have painstakingly read through every slide and put all of you to sleep. And I have that information for you if you would like more, and I've got places to send you where you can learn more about that. All of that is to simply set the context for us to begin asking questions about what does it mean for us as the Christian community, right, to honor our neighbor, to seek human dignity and human flourishing, even as we honor the emperor and recognize that there are good laws and that the government does things that are good and that politics itself is not an evil. But sometimes there are laws that maybe are bad or even laws that have unintended consequences. Who knew that the 1986 law that Ronald Reagan passed would become a stumbling block and a roadblock for immigration reform in 2020? But it has. How do we begin as a Christian community with all of these variables to address the reality, as Skillen says, not the ideological abstract, but the reality of the world and the situation in which we live? And how do we do it in a way that we overcome our ideological barriers and begin having real and meaningful conversations with one another about a way forward? So just a few things in closing, and then I would love to hear your questions and whatever else you have to say. No, you can go back to that slide. All right. So how do we get a Christian approach to politics? And this is what I'm seeking. A politics grounded in the authority of God as the creator who makes all things good, politics being one of them, so that our politics is grounded in our love of God, and one that seeks human dignity, so that love of neighbor, and one that also then seeks the flourishing of all creation. How do we approach this issue in a way that seeks the common good? All right, next slide. And how do we do it in a way that honors the emperor? So to all of you and to my good friend who may be listening or may not be listening, I know we don't have an emperor. I understand that. But again, it becomes a symbol of our political world and the political structures in which we live. How do we see politics as a creational good? How do we seek justice? Remember, Peter in that passage again says, do good, do good. How do we seek to do good in the midst of all of these really difficult realities in which we live? How do we affirm the dignity of the human person? And this is really, really important to me, because I don't think, if we can't do this second to last one, then we can't have conversation. And this goes both ways. I understand that. This is not just a Republican problem or a Democrat problem. This is a problem of the culture in which we live. Somehow we have got to find a way to begin to, as Peter did, pull the emperor back down with the rest of us, right? To de-divinize this whole thing and realize that, yes, you may vote for this candidate or this candidate for very good reasons. but to recognize and overcome some of those ideological issues that are present. Otherwise, we can't talk to one another. We can't talk to one another. And I think that's part of the problem. And how do we work all things out in love? You know, Paul says the governing rule and law of the Christian community is now love. How do we learn to love one another so that we can talk to one another and seek the common good so that we can love God and love our neighbors? All right? Now, I believe that was the last slide. Is that right, Becca? One more. Oh, yeah, good. Okay. That's where I was headed. What we have to begin talking about then is what do we do? What's the way forward on this issue? What are the primary issues right now that we should be focusing on? Where are there places that we can actually take action? Because I can read your minds. I can see the little thought bubbles. Oh, that's all nice and good, but what should we do about it, right? Well, that's next Sunday. We're going to talk about some concrete ways that we can begin having conversations on this issue and that we can begin, hopefully, moving forward, trying to enact meaningful change and seeking what I believe is meaningful immigration reform that honors our neighbor, loves our neighbor, and in the context of loving God. All right? So that is it. I am very curious to hear what thoughts and responses you have. Again, as we think about the what's next, the nuts and bolts of looking at practical ways we can address this issue next time, but I'm very curious to hear your questions or response to anything that I've talked about here this evening.
A question, Jason.
Yeah.
Most of the, if not all of the information you've given us refers to the United States.
Yeah.
And in preparation for what you have on the screen for next Sunday,
Yeah.
could we find out and learn from you what goes on in Canada, what goes on in Europe?
Yeah.
I mean, what are they doing well? What are they doing differently? We're not in this alone.
No, that's a great question, and I will try to find some information, although I will say this is where we live. And so we are trying to deal with the realities here. But definitely, I think it's important for us to think globally. I mean, we live in a global community now. That's just the way that it is, and then the way that it is going to be. So I think number one, that would be helpful. Another way to reframe that question is, and I think this is important as well, is for us to begin to realize that some of my Guatemalan neighbors would rather be living in Guatemala. They don't want to be here, but they're here because their family was threatened. And what do you do when your family is threatened? You do whatever you have to. But I wonder if, given their choice, they would want to live in Guatemala. What does it look like for us to think about politics, not just in the terms of our own country, but also how does our politics impact other countries? So I think your global push is the right direction. I think that's good.
So how do you think our maybe elitist devaluation of physical labor plays into all of this? I mean, you know, we always want to be better than our parents' generation or whatever. Yeah. So devaluating the physical labor in the meat processing industry or the hotel industry or the food service industry or whatever.
Yeah. And I promise you I'm not going to keep saying we're going to talk about that next time. But so today it was interesting. My mom and dad are here. And I'll just put it this way. My mom and dad and I don't agree on politics. And usually it's my mom that gets more like fired up about it. Well, they went for a walk. And so it was me and my dad. And we had this really fascinating conversation. And it was that issue that came up as we look at the 1965 law on immigration, and we looked at the numbers that are allowed in for the different levels of employment, and we'll look at those tiers. What's fascinating about it is it privileges what you referred to as elitist, the educated, you know, the doctors, the lawyers, the CEOs. And when you look at the number of people who are allowed to immigrate to this country to work in what, for lack of a better term, we might call blue, it is very small. And that is a big part of the problem. So when we think about some of the people who live here in Sioux Center, my neighbor, for example, the mom works the day shift at the pork plant, and the son works the night shift. I have no idea, what their status is or whatever. But they're blue-collar workers. And I think one way we can think about changing our immigration policy is to rethink some of those issues on the employment track of immigration. So I think that's important.
Jason, I'd appreciate it if for next week, in terms of preparation, we get a little history of the degree to which principled pluralism has been a foreign policy or any kind of an objective with respect to immigration, foreign policy, foreign aid, or whether it's just not out there, and that if that's an important part of the solution, I think we need to know that.
That's great. Yeah, that's good. I will definitely do some work.
I don't even know how to ask this, but I have some acquaintances from Central America, and they are upset not so much with our laws as with the fact that they were told, and many people have been told, that if, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, that if they can just get here, they will be let in. And so droves come, and then they find out, what?
Yeah.
We can't come in? Now what do we do? And then they are really stuck.
Yeah.
So I don't know, what is that?
No, you're hitting on, I think, something, there's a couple ways to think about it. Because as we think about, and this is the conversation I had with my dad today, when we think about people that I met, like in Tijuana a year ago when I was there, I mean, this woman, their family, they had a business, the gangs were shaking them down, threatening their life. And I just said to my dad, I said, Dad, what would you do? I was like, oh, no question. Of course I would go, right? And so you have that sense of people who are coming here because America is this, place of hope, place of opportunity, and so on. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there are people then who come and they get here and they get stuck. And the stuckness leads to other problems. So Jordan Bruxford works in the Sioux Falls area for the Naomi Project, which works with human trafficking. And what's fascinating is the human trafficking issue is connected to the immigration issue. Because when you are undocumented, you have no recourse. Who are you going to go tell? And they hold it over them. And so there's just this cascade of all of these different issues. You probably, I don't know if you saw in the news, I think, the plant in Sioux Falls, the issue there with what went on with COVID. There was a person who died from the virus. And it was interesting because, talking to a woman who was involved with everything going on there, they were promised $500 bonuses called responsibility bonuses, like come to work. And, you're an immigrant and you're seeking to make your way, you're trusting, and it leads to problems. So you're absolutely right. I mean, that whole area of, come to America and it will be fine, and then they get here and they're met with that is a problem. And, this is kind of jumping off of what you're talking about, and this is where I said both Republicans and Democrats that I talked to across the board agree. We have a large number of people here, and we're not sending them back. How do we make steps to get them some form of legal status, whether it is just permanent legal residency? And I've talked to some immigrants who were like, I'll take it. I don't need to vote. I'll take it. Then I don't have to look over my shoulder and worry. Or citizenship. How do we begin making those steps? At the same time, we work at reforming the system so that more people can come legally and not fall into the traps that you're talking about. No, that's a good point. Other questions?
Just to follow up on what was just said, it bothers me tremendously, and I've given talks on immigration and so forth, and one of the things that people come to me with, and I also hear it on the radio and so forth, the fact that they're criminals.
Yeah.
They're criminals. They came here illegally. That makes them criminals.
Yeah.
And in light of what you just heard there, or even in the fact that they were recruited,
Yeah, right.
you have to realize nobody told them they were going to be criminals.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is one of the things that the National Immigration Forum, and this is where I have to be careful, because the two organizations that I work for don't always fully agree on some things, even though we're working for the same end. But the National Immigration Forum is really working for what they would call restitution-based immigration reform, which I'll talk about a little bit next time. And it tries to address that very issue. You've come here, you've broken a law. And, you know, when you think about it, it was about 2 months ago, right? I'm driving up to Minnesota, and I'm going 80 on the back road, and a cop pulls me over. Gives me a ticket. I've broken the law. There's a way for me to get right with the law. I pay my fine. There's no way for them to get right, right? And think about the DACA recipients. These kids who are brought over, they're on the wrong side of the law, and there's no way for them to get right. And so one of the things that the National Immigration Forum is really seriously focusing on is, how do we establish a mechanism to help people get right with the law? And I think that's something we should talk about next time. Because again, there's a large number of people, both sides agree, for the most part, we're not deporting all of these people. So what mechanisms can we create to help them get right with the law? Now, the other piece that I would go with, you know, this is the conversation my father and I had, you know, about the criminal issue. You know, you think about 1986, you think about 1996, and we've really begun this militarization of the border. And it really gets ramped up with those two laws. And nobody's saying we shouldn't have borders, and nobody's saying we don't have the right to protect our borders. But what if we were actually trying to protect our borders from the real criminals? And one of the ways I think immigration reform can be helpful is if we can find legal channels for people who want to come to this country, whether it's through asylum, seeking asylum, TPS, or redoing our immigration process. Now we allow the border police, the border agents, to really begin to focus on the real criminals, who, by the way, nobody wants. The immigrants don't want them here. So I think immigration reform can have a positive effect on border security as well.
So I guess one other thing is, what can we do to stabilize Central America to, without nation building, right? To take away, not saying that in a bad way, but to take away the incentive for them to come, right?
I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I mean, again, for the majority of immigrants that you talk to, they would love to stay in their country, and they would love for their country to be a place where they can have human flourishing. And I think as we think about global politics, I think that is also something that we need to be thinking about.
You've talked mostly about the Central American immigrants. I'm wondering about the refugees from Syria and from Bangladesh, and those places where that's a much more difficult situation, I would think.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, one of the things that I did, so the presentation that I gave on the history part is from the Office of Social Justice, and it was longer, and I shortened it up. And I made those choices in part because as I think about our community, I think, predominantly we have people from Central America. But one of the slides that I took out and probably should have left in is when we think about the impact of 9/11, when we think about the whole war on terror, and then the way in which we think about Muslims and deal with, the Muslim world. That has created, I think, a challenge for us to think about as a Christian community as we now know that there's a whole group of Syrians who have been displaced, and Europe has really taken the brunt of that. And in some ways, the United States has kind of pushed that to the side. And again, this is where the principled pluralism, as I would think of it, and as I think of what Skillen is getting at, and as I think about Abraham Kuyper, and realizing that sometimes to seek the common good, to seek human flourishing, also includes the human flourishing of people who don't believe like us. So that how do we as a Christian community recognize our Muslim neighbors made in the image of God? How do we seek the common good for them as well? And right now, the asylum and refugee process is it's a real mess. And personally, I think that is where the Christian community needs to, with a lot of these issues, but with this in particular, we need to raise our voices. And especially in the Christian Reformed Church, because that's what we've been so good at. I mean, I really feel like that's a place where we can say, yes, we've tried to meet the challenge there. And what does it look like for us to do that now? And this is where, I would say, I'm going to dip my toe into some controversial waters here. These politicians don't care what some professor from Northwestern College thinks about these issues. They really don't. So I go meet with them, and they put in their time, and it's like one of the persons I was meeting with from one of the offices kind of pulled me aside. And he just said, I just want you to know that it's not going to be until the business leaders, community leaders, the workers begin to raise their voices that many of these politicians are going to find the political will to do this. And I would even say this, those of you who are Republicans who say, you know what, I'm going to vote for Trump for whatever reason, I would actually say you have more power than anybody. Because again, some of the Republican politicians aren't going to care care so much about what one of their Democratic constituency thinks. They do care what you think. And what does it look like for people in the Christian community who have voted for Trump, who have voted for Grassley, who have voted for Ernst, to go meet with them and say, I am a supporter, and here's why. And by the way, this refugee issue, this asylum issue, it's wrong. And we need to do better. They're going to hear you. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in these 3 times that we're together is to encourage you to not pull away from the political process, but it's going to take us all getting involved in the political process. Because really, and this sounds like some cheesy cliche, but we do have the power as the people. I mean, that's where my friend was going. We don't have an emperor, right? We can vote people in and out, and we can. And how do we not become disengaged out of cynicism, but how does our faith allow us to become engaged, seeking the common good regardless of where we land? But I just want to encourage all of us to say, you've got the power. And the question will be, how do we use that? How do we channel it to seek the common good?
All right, that could be a good closing note, unless there is one more kind of urgent question or observation. We're near 6. Let's thank Jason again for giving us a good presentation. Thanks so much, Jason.